This first class was unique. They were risk takers. It's exciting to have a couple of them here with us tonight. Olin was not yet accredited. There was no curriculum. There were not even buildings when these students arrived. So yet their careers have gone in some fascinating directions, and Kate has done exceptionally well. So I'll tell you a little bit about Kate's career. She is currently a managing partner at Sonder Capital, an assistant director of the Stanford Biodesign Innovation Fellowship. Kate, I'm glad to see you have some Stanford friends here. You're well represented.
Yes, go Cardinals. I'm a Phoenix fan myself, but got to represent Stanford a little bit.
Prior to Sonder, Kate was CEO of Ciel Medical, which she co-founded out of the Biodesign Innovation Fellowship. Ciel focused on the need to reduce ventilator acquired pneumonia, a problem which costs the US healthcare system billions of dollars a year. Ciel was acquired by Vyaire Medical in 2017, and Kate transitioned to vice president of Airway technologies at Vyaire. Previously, she was a strategic marketing consultant at Acclarent and an R&D engineer at Pathway Medical. Kate has co-authored over a dozen patents and has received multiple honorary fellowships, including being one of the first recipients of the Ferolyn Fellowship. So please join me in welcoming Kate Garrett. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Sally. Well, it's really nice to see all of you and fun to hear that there are quite a few folks with backgrounds in the either healthcare or biomedical engineering space. So welcome. And I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to share my screen. I have a presentation that I'll walk through, but I would welcome anybody to stop me with questions along the way if they have any, because this will be way more fun if we're interactive. But otherwise, I do have a number of slides to share with you guys. So, in high level, the theme of my presentation is how to impact patient care without necessarily having an MD or a degree in medicine, because I do believe it's very possible, and it's a well-worn path. Many have come before me, but I'm excited to share my journey with you in doing that. So, and Sally touched on several of these logos on the screen. This is my background in a snapshot, and I'd say there's two themes from my career history to date, and that one is startups. So I have been involved almost exclusively in startups for my entire career since graduating from Olin, and even Olin was a startup. Tommy and I were part of the first class to graduate, so I very much consider it a startup. Of all of the logos on this slide, Biodesign or Stanford is the most established organization I've ever been part of. The biodesign program was, I think, 11 years old when I attended. So that's the most kind of, advanced institution I've been part of. And I want to back up a little bit and talk about how, my early career, the transition post Olin and into biodesign, and how I even got into the healthcare field at all. When I was at Olin, I had a fortuitous introduction one summer when I was looking for internships, and it came through Debbie Chatra, who was my advisor at the time. She had a friend that had founded a startup. It was a collaboration between Mass General Hospital and MIT to develop a technology to gather minimally invasive genetic information about a fetus. And at the time, amniocentesis was the only alternative out there, which is effectively sticking a really long needle into the fetus in order to extract fluid and get that genetic information, but it came with a risk of miscarriage. And so Living Microsystem was trying to develop just a blood test. You could draw blood from the mom's arm, which today is standard of care, but this was almost 20 years ago, was really novel idea. And so it was, during this summer, I ended up getting the internship. I actually had two aunts that were pregnant and 40 years old. And so really at risk, the patient population that this was impacting. And it really hit home for me how much medical technologies can change people's lives, people, that we know. And I just decided that summer, this was summer after sophomore year, that I was going to commit my career to the healthcare space. So when I graduated, I joined Pathway Medical. Pathway was an early stage startup out in Seattle, developing peripheral atherectomy catheters. A simple way to describe it is like a flexible drill bit for your arteries to clear plaque out of your arteries and reestablish blood flow. And it was an amazing experience. I was the 30th employee when I joined. The company grew to about 180. And I had really amazing kind of opportunities and exposure there, given the size and the growth trajectory, and specifically in R&D. So I was an R&D engineer. And I loved it. It was amazing. But I wanted to learn not just how to develop technologies, once you know what technology needed to be developed, how to get it through the FDA, how to get it to the market. But I really wanted to back up and understand, how do you even know what problems to work on in the healthcare sector? How do you know what solutions are the right ones to solve those problems? And I wasn't getting that in R&D. In R&D, I was just being told, okay, make a catheter of this size. And then, a few months later, I'd be like, nope, actually our top priority is this catheter or this functionality. So I really wanted to understand the upstream process, like how do you figure out what problems to solve? And that's how I found Stanford Biodesign. The CEO of Pathway told me about Stanford Biodesign and was like, this is what you got to do. It's amazing. It's exactly what you're looking for. And what it is a one-year fellowship at Stanford, where they bring a small number of engineers and doctors together to go in and observe patient care in the hospital. So for a year, you have direct access to watch patient care and see unmet needs. So you observe patient care, you write down problems that you see, and then you spend the year kind of working through characterizing those problems. And I'll talk more about that. But that was the goal of fellowship. I heard about it and I was like, this is love at first sight. It's a very academic fellowship. Most people come out of graduate, PhDs or, through medical training to come to biodesign. So it required an academic recommendation. And at this point, I'm 5 years, out of Olin and haven't been in school, that whole time. But Mark Somerville came through, and despite my having graduated, almost 5 years ago, he was very gracious and signed right up to write me a letter of recommendation. So I want to just make sure I acknowledge the role that several really instrumental faculty members have played in my journey through medtech. So I'm going to back up a bit and talk about the Stanford Biodesign process and walk you through the project that I did during that graduate year, which ultimately turned into my company called Ciel Medical. And please, go ahead and stop me if anybody has questions along the way. Now, I know many of you are in technology development, have been there. How many of you have been in a situation where you have a technology and it's really cool? It's some great innovation. It's some new advancement in capability. And you take that and you say, okay, now we got to find an application for this. Like, here's this major scientific breakthrough. Let's go find a place where this can add value. That is, fairly common in terms of an innovation strategy, particularly out of, major academic institutions. Certainly something that happens a lot at Stanford. They have an Office of Technology and Licensing where innovators and, inventors at Stanford can submit their ideas, and OTL tries to find people that want to license them. But the fundamental premise of the Stanford Biodesign project is that those are flipped, that innovation should be need-driven. You should know what the problem is first, and only then try to invent technologies to solve it. And so that's a really key kind of flip in how they think about it. And really that's the foundation of my own personal training in innovation in medtech. This is what we call the Biodesign Mantra. There's a textbook that's been written and used around the world. But they say a well-characterized need is the DNA of a great invention. So that is the foundation of innovation. And what we spend, months, weeks, if not months at Biodesign doing is trying to come up with a need statement that characterizes what the underlying unmet need is. And the structure of that is a way to kind of insert your problem statement in a population, insert your population in order to affect some outcome. And it seems really simple when you look at it on this piece of paper, but I promise you it's actually quite challenging. And we literally, I was a fellow over a decade ago. I've now been on faculty for 4 years and watched the fellows go through it themselves every year. It's really difficult to do this correctly because it takes months of research and validation in order to get this just right. But it is the foundation of the biodesign process. So I'm going to walk you through my own experience at Biodesign, what we came up with as a problem and the company that resulted. So when I was there, I observed this problem in the ICU called ventilator-associated pneumonia, or VAP. And VAP is defined as a pneumonia that occurs after 48 hours of ventilation. So it's not just short-term, but people who are really critically ill and on a ventilator a long time for life support. And VAP, or pneumonia caused by the ventilator, is one of the most common ICU infections. So it leads to a 10% increased mortality, 6 extra days in the ICU. It requires broad spectrum antibiotics in order to treat it. And it has a high cost associated with it. It's about $40,000 net cost to treat a patient who gets pneumonia on the ventilator. And because it's hospital acquired, hospitals are on the hook for most of that cost. There's about 3.5 million patients in the US annually who are on longer term ventilation and at risk for this. And given kind of the incidence profile of pneumonia, it's about a $4 billion cost annually in the US alone. So it's a really big problem, not only in terms of patient impact, but dollar spend. So we dug into the problem. We said, okay, what's going on? What causes this? And it's actually, by the time I was looking at it, in 2011, well understood what the problem is. So this is a cross section of a person, and it's showing, for those of you that aren't familiar with this space, but there's a breathing tube in order to pump oxygen into your lungs. That breathing tube is inserted through your mouth and into your lungs. That's the tube that you kind of see going through the mouth and into the trachea. And at the bottom of that tube, it holds open your vocal cords, which normally close unless you're speaking. It holds open your vocal cords because that tube has to pass through. And then there's a balloon at the base of it to kind of inflate and, and hold back liquid that cools up as best it can, and also keep the oxygen in the lungs that gets pumped in. But the problem is because the vocal cords are open, fluid can get past them into the trachea. And over time, it pools above this cuff and it drips past, because these cuffs are not perfect seals. And it's been shown, again, this was known 10 years ago when I was at Biodesign, that if you can minimize secretions pooling above the cuff, you can significantly reduce the risk of pneumonia by over half and decrease length of stay. That was 13 randomized controlled trials. This was well established by many people. So we know what the problem is, and we generally know how to solve it. But if you go and look at what the options were, there was really no easy solution to get those secretions out, because they're going in and they're suctioning in the mouth every day. Respiratory therapists and nurses are going in and suctioning, but it's really difficult to get those soft catheters to where you want them. Given the curvature of the airway, these catheters aren't steerable. They're like 20 cents each. You just get stuck at the back of the mouth and only getting secretions in the mouth. You can't get down to those high risk secretions past the vocal cords in the airway. So again, going back to the biodesign, the need statement, I think a lot of people looked at this problem because, again, it was well known, well established, and thought, all right, this is pretty clear. The endotracheal tube is the problem here. It's holding open the vocal cords. Those cuffs are really crappy barriers. We need to come up with an improved endotracheal tube to reduce the risk of aspiration in ventilated patients. And the reality is, lots of people did that. Every major player in the critical care space had come up with an improved endotracheal tube, whether that tube had a different cuff design, so like a tapered cuff to fit all kinds of trachea sizes, a different cuff material, really thin or really compliant materials. Some people coated endotracheal tubes with silver to reduce the bacteria content of the secretions. They embedded suction lines in those tubes in order to suck out the secretions down at the cuff. It was, lots of people had done this. And the reality is that they worked. There were 13 randomized controlled trials, those studies that I talked about earlier that showed reducing those secretions matters and it makes a difference. Those were done on improved endotracheal tubes. So we knew they worked. But again, 10 years ago, all of this was known. And I went out and I talked to hospitals around the country, and almost nobody was using them across the board in their ventilated patients, despite how big of a problem pneumonia was. So I'm going to go back to kind of the biodesign mantra, which is you really have to understand the problem. And here's a picture, those of us live in big cities, no traffic. You look at this and you think, okay, traffic, like we can come up with all kinds of ideas. We can make the roadways bigger. We could set certain hours that people can come on, come off. We can carpool. But the problem is, if innovation doesn't start with, just a quick look at something. You really have to understand the underlying need behind a problem. And let's say it's lions in Africa that are creating this traffic jam. all those ideas we had come up with is going to do absolutely nothing to fix this problem. And innovation occurs when you develop a solution that's uniquely suited to solve the underlying need and problem in that situation. So we went back to do need finding for VAP and try to figure out what the true underlying problem was. And as an engineer, I wasn't a clinician. At this point, I had been an R&D engineer for 5 years. I had spent a little bit of time in hospitals doing case support, but absolutely no medical training. So how did we figure out the problem? We went to the literature. I read hundreds of articles from, 60 years of research. I went out and talked to people. I talked to the physicians, the nurses, the respiratory therapists who are all providing care for these long-term ventilated patients. I also, in addition to that, called sales reps, like who was selling the specialty endotracheal tubes? Why weren't they being bought? I talked to the value analysis committees at hospitals to figure out their purchasing decisions. I talked to engineers that made all kinds of different solutions, manufacturers, distributors, regulatory experts, et cetera. I talked to anybody I could talk to really understand all angles of this problem. And here is what we found. So what we found is that in the US, there are 30 million people intubated annually. So intubated is when you put that breathing tube into your airway to pump oxygen into your lungs. But again, remember that pneumonia, ventilator-acquired pneumonia, only affects people who stay on the ventilator long-term. Most of these intubations occur in the operating room for very short procedures. When you go under general anesthesia, that means putting an endotracheal tube in your throat to pump oxygen into your lungs. Most of the time, they're taken out after a few hours. Only 10% of people go on extended ventilation in the ICU and are at risk for pneumonia. Specialty endotracheal tubes that have all these features that reduce VAP are 10 to 50 times the cost of a basic tube. So hospitals are looking at this and thinking, okay, well, I'm not going to use these across the board because 90-something% of them don't need it. It's just wasted money on these patients to put these specialty tubes in. So that kind of makes sense. But here's the challenge. It's really hard to know who is somebody who's going to be at risk. And so if you go downstream and you look at the stakeholders in this problem, you have the critical care providers. So these are the folks in the ICU who are caring for the long-term ventilated patients. They're the ones who are diagnosing, treating, and reporting VAP. VAP is a quality metric for these hospitals. They have to report it and they are graded. Their performance is based on how much pneumonia they have. So they really care because they're the ones who have to track it and treat it. But most endotracheal tubes are not placed in the ICU. They're placed in the operating room. And that person only goes on extended ventilation if something doesn't go right during the procedure. But they're not going to swap out the tube because at this point, the patient is critically ill. They're heavily sedated. It's actually contraindicated by guidelines to swap out a tube when somebody comes into the ICU. So they're stuck with a decision that was made upstream. But outside of the ICU, most of these tubes are placed by anesthesiologists and ER physicians. But again, the vast majority of their patients get extubated. The tube gets taken out in a few hours. Only a small percentage of their patients go into the ICU and only a small percentage of them get VAP. Also, these physicians never deal with VAP. Like it's not a problem that's theirs to treat. They're in the operating room. So there's a real kind of misalignment of the stakeholders here. So we looked at this and we came up with a new need statement. Our need statement was a way to reduce the risk of aspiration in long-term intubated patients that can be applied post-intubation to prevent VAP. So there were two key changes here. One, we removed the technology assumption because by embedding a technology or an improved endotracheal tube, you're limiting yourself to a solution set of just endotracheal tubes. You got to take that out. It's kind of a fundamental rule of the biodesign process. The other thing we did is we added our insight, which is that we have to be able to apply this post-intubation when we know somebody needs this extra cost and this extra safety measure. So this is another, I won't go into this, but as part of biodesign, you come up with must-have and nice-to-have criteria for success for your solution. And so we had done that process as well. And then we went into brainstorming. We came up with all kinds of, some crazy, some good ideas, did a lot of prototyping. We actually spent close to a year developing this color picture here, which was a secondary balloon cuff, a highly compliant balloon that you could slide over the endotracheal tube. just in the patients that needed it, that would create a really effective barrier, but ultimately abandoned it due to just ease of use issues. And what we came up with is what we ended up calling the Sherpa suction system. So it was a delivery guide and a custom catheter. The delivery guide got the catheter kind of through the upper airway and positioned it to go through the vocal cords and into the subglottic space. So it was a system of a delivery guide and a custom catheter. So now we had this great idea, had some prototypes. How did we take it to market? It was through a lot of different testing. So we started with bench testing. We went to all of the critical care conferences, and we had nurses and respiratory therapists who would actually be using the device, try it out in bench models. We proved that we could get, to really consistent delivery success to, deep in the airway where we wanted to go with a variety of users. We did a lot of preclinical testing, both in cadavers and animal studies. I have spent more time with cadavers than I ever thought I would in engineering school. We have intubated over 30 cadavers and really tested a whole wide variety of airway anatomies. We did both kind of short-term animal studies to show delivery and removal of fluid. And we also did long-term kind of multi-day animal studies just to show the safety of leaving our catheter behind in these animals. And ultimately, we did do human studies in intubated patients in the ICU, both to show delivery and also to show secretion removal. So we brought this technology to market. And, the first version of it that we brought out was not the version that we that was acquired or that was broadly commercialized. We had a lot of learning to do post-use in hospitals with real patients, with real respiratory therapists and nurses in hospitals around the country that had different protocols, different resources available. So we went through a number of iterations to try to make the device as easy to use as possible, as reliable as possible. And we added in, an extra feature. We needed a securement device to hold it in place because tape just wasn't working, which was readily available everywhere. And it was only through, almost 2 years of iterating after we went commercial that we ultimately landed on the final embodiment of what was acquired by Vyaire. So we ultimately, the company was acquired by Vyaire Medical, who was $1 billion startup, I say, because they had, it was an old business unit. It was CareFusion's respiratory division. That Becton Dickinson had bought CareFusion, but really didn't want to deal with the respiratory division. So it had been spun out just a few months before we were acquired. It had been bought by a private equity group and spun out as a new company called Vyaire. So they were kind of getting their feet under themselves, trying to remove the employees and all the products from CareFusion, Becton Dickinson into this new standalone entity. But Vyaire Medical bought us because they really wanted to be part of kind of bringing innovation to respiratory. It was really exciting because, not only was it great for giving investors liquidity, but it gave us a 50-person sales force in the US. And commercializing medical products is, can be very challenging as a small company on your own. But having a 50-person sales force that was motivated and dedicated to launching this was really, really exciting for us. And I always say, it was great to have kind of investors make money and everybody have a nice win under their belt. But to me, this was the ultimate success in the whole story. This is a picture. One of the respiratory therapists at University of Cincinnati sent me this picture from their ICU. This is a picture of our product being stocked in their ICU as standard of care for use in their patients. And I always say this was the most impactful picture from my whole journey in it, because at the end of the day, this is why we do it, is to try to get something that we think is going to make a difference in patient care. So that was kind of my journey as an entrepreneur and innovator. And I've recently switched over to being an investor, which is a pretty big pivot, and happy to kind of cover in detail how that happened. But the short story is that one of my board members at Ciel, who had been there from the beginning all the way through to acquisition, after I worked at Vyaire for about 1.5 years, integrating our product into their organization, Jay Watkins, who was on our board, was founding a new venture firm with a couple of colleagues called Sonder Capital. And he reached out to me and said, hey, do you want to join us as a founding partner? And it was kind of too great of an opportunity for me to pass up. So I switched over to the investor side to work with folks that I had a history of working with in the past and that I was really excited to keep learning from and working with. So I had a couple of biases, having an engineering background myself, a couple of biases towards what it meant to be an investor. And I want to tell you a little bit of what it's actually like to be an investor and what it's not like. So what are, my role as an investor now? There's, my day-to-day, one, I've got to raise money in order to be able to invest money. I have to go out and convince people to give us money to invest in some unknown thing. You just say, hey, let me have $100 million and just trust me. I'm going to put it to work in some really cool things. So that's not that easy, but that's job number one. Two, you've got to find great deals. So you've got to find companies that you want to invest in and support. And that often comes through your network. People I actually recently saw an Olin founded company called SafeBeat, which was really fun, that I was connected through a recent Olin alumni. Third, you've got to, once you find those companies, you've got to convince entrepreneurs to take your capital over others. Sometimes some of the best deals out there get competitive and a lot of people would like to invest in them. So you've got to convince them that you bring things beyond just the capital. Then you join the board, not always, but at least at Sonder, we tend to lead deals and get very involved. So we're often joining the board. And through that, you're advising, you're supporting, you're encouraging, and you're guiding company leaders. So you're not there on a day-to-day basis, but you provide kind of high-level guidance and support for those teams. And then eventually, the responsibility of an investor is to get liquidity and to return the capital to our investors with a multiple, and hopefully a really big multiple on what they gave us. So they give us more capital to then put to work in more technologies that we think are going to change patient lives. So what it's not is it's certainly not just making a ton of money sitting around doing not much. I will tell you that my days are very full. I have lived the engineering life. I have lived the founder entrepreneur life. Yes, there's some nice parts about being an investor, but it's not this super cush, just like lays about job at all. The best investors work really hard to do all the things above in order to create value for their companies, and in that way, create value for their own investors. The other thing is, as an investor and board member, you are not making day-to-day operating decisions. That is the job of the founding teams. You are there to help guide and provide input, but at the end of the day, they're responsible for making those decisions. And so that's a big shift for somebody who's been an operator entrepreneur, just to realize like, it's not your job anymore. Like you shouldn't be making decisions. You need to leave it to the team. So I thought it'd be fun just to share a couple of examples from our portfolio. These are not technologies that I've been involved in inventing in any way, but they're technologies that we have invested in and that companies that I sit on the board of now. So the first one is called Brius. This one's really fun. It's actually an orthodontic invention invented by a couple of very brilliant technical founders with orthodontics and mathematics background. So what they're doing is a new way of braces. So we think about this as kind of like next generation braces. It sits behind the teeth, so it's completely invisible. And I'm going to play this video so you can see. Before I start, I'll just explain that the way it's designed is this U-bar has springs coming off of it for each individual tooth. And the way this appliance is made out of nitinol, which has shape memory. And so what that means is highly elastic. So the springs start like this, you can stretch them into any shape you want, and then they'll always want to go back to their natural resting place. So this appliance is designed custom for every patient, where the springs are naturally want to sit where you want the teeth to be. And when you install it in the patient, you just stretch those springs and attach them to the teeth where they are today. And then that shape memory kind of pulls the teeth individually into the location you want. So here's a quick video just showing it at work. This is a wax model. This is a really old video, but I think helps illustrate kind of how it works. So one of the things that's unique about this is because not only is it invisible and sit behind the teeth, but because these teeth are moving individually, there's no wire connecting all of them to each other and them all moving relative to one another. They're moving independently, which means they can take the most efficient path from where they are today to where you want them to be. And that allows you to reduce treatment times. So we invested in this company several years ago when they had done just a handful of patients in the US. We've now done close to 3,000 patients, shown that we can treat the full range of case complexity, and our treatment times are less than half of traditional braces. So consumers love this because who wants braces? Like, that's so old school. You got all that metal on the front of your teeth. This sits behind the teeth, completely invisible, and it takes less than half the time. So really excited about this. It's a massive opportunity to impact millions of people. We have 4 million people who start braces every year in the US, and kind of just a fun one with also massive market opportunity. So another one, this is a company called Zateo, and this is in medical imaging. And this one I always think is fun because it was founded by two scientific founders. One is a PhD physicist who worked at the national labs out here in California doing research for national defense purposes. So he was tasked with being able to find really trace amounts of nuclear active material in buildings and in cars for security reasons. And in doing that, he came up with some really novel approaches to find very small amounts of material very quickly. And he was at home telling his wife about this over dinner, and she was a PhD in oncology research, working at the other national labs out here in California. And she was like, we look for nuclear matter in medicine all the time. Like, if you have a way to find really small amounts quickly, that could have medical applications. And they ended up spinning this company called Zateo out to do just that. And the goal is to take what today we have kind of 5 to 10 millimeter resolution of our nuclear medicine imaging that's used for oncology and lots of other applications, but to drop that down by an order of magnitude. So to get 1 millimeter resolution for tumor detection. And the reason that that's important is because if you can catch tumors earlier, if you can see them when they're smaller, you can treat them when they're smaller and improve both treatment planning and patient outcomes long-term. So really excited about this. This is an early, they're still in technical development, but really excited about the potential to really transform oncology treatment with this. In addition to the resolution, there's a number of other benefits of what they've invented that would allow this system to be portable, whereas current molecular imaging require these bunkers, like these dedicated rooms with massive capital equipment and 6-foot concrete walls. It's very expensive to set that up, and means that it's only available in specialized imaging and cancer centers. This is a portable system that would allow the technology to be available in just about any location. So really excited about that one and the impact that we could potentially have on patient care. So I'll just end with my quick summary is that I do think, it's the opportunity abounds to impact patient care without having an MD. And it's been such a joy in my career to have any small role in that and to see patients and see what a difference we can make with technology. So I always love to encourage people to go into this field. I got to give my plug in here for Stanford Biodesign and say that innovation should be need driven, not technology driven, but I really do believe that some of the best innovation comes from starting with the need. It's about people, not just patients, of course, patients and the impact we can make, but the people along the way, the people we work with. All of my own career decisions have been made about trying to work with the best people that I possibly could to learn from and grow from kind of watching them. And lastly, I would say, it does take courage to disrupt things, to change the status quo. And all of these startups have had dark days along with the bright days. And I just remember, it's about the people and it's about the patients. And that's what helps me get through the dark days, but it's definitely worth it. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Kate. I'd love to invite people to, since it's a pretty small group, just feel free to raise your hand or or ask a question. It's a nice size group for this, for the discussion. Thank you, Kate. That was wonderful.
Hey, Kate.
Hi, Tommy.
I got a question for you. How much of this involved doors being open just because of what, going back to the Ciel, doors being open because of your involvement with the Stanford Biodesign Institute, or can entrepreneurs just find themselves talking to physicians and nurses and paramedics on their own?
I think like it certainly was facilitated a lot by having the affiliation with Stanford Biodesign, because it gave me access to all of Stanford Hospital to go in and observe care. Most clinicians in Stanford knew what the biodesign program was and were willing, to let me come visit or take my call, grab coffee. But a lot of who we spoke to were outside the university. And yes, I could say, hi, I'm affiliated with Stanford, I'm doing a research project, and that helps. But what I found in general is that people in this industry are just looking for better solutions for patients. And I would encourage people to reach out, to just try. I mean, you could say, if you're interested in looking at, in a certain area and getting some feedback, just tell people what's motivating you. And, you probably would have a higher hit rate if you were coming from Stanford Biodesign, but I think you'll have a pretty good hit rate anyway. It might be hard to observe patient care, though. That's the one thing that can be difficult, especially now with hospital credentialing. It's very difficult to get into hospitals. Post-COVID, like even more hard than it was before. So that would certainly take time to kind of build that access and credibility, but conversations with people, I think just about anybody can do.
Thanks.
If I could tag on to that line of thinking, how would you compare Stanford Biodesign as a route into successful entrepreneurship compared to, other ways you might get involved of just operating or just starting your own?
Yeah, well, I have to hold the party line here because I'm on faculty now, and they always say, the whole point of Stanford Biodesign is not to start a company. And Josh McGower is one of the founders of the program. And that's what he told me when I interviewed, because I was like, I want to start a company in the med tech space. Like, I want to be an entrepreneur. He was like, well, Kate, don't plan on that after this fellowship. That's not the goal of this. What Biodesign does is teaches you the process of innovation so you can apply it in your career subsequent to it. That being said, there's like 65 or 70 companies that have been founded out of Stanford Biodesign. It's one of the most successful programs in the world, if not the most successful, at least academically, in terms of starting companies, raising capital, patent formation, patient impact in terms of technologies that went to market. So you have a great shot if you go through Stanford Biodesign, certainly probably higher than just doing it the average, right, on doing it on your own. But there are many paths into innovation and founding companies, and Biodesign is certainly not the only one. It's probably a tiny fraction of how people get into the field and found companies.
I have a question. So obviously you were doing a lot of this work on respiration and intubation like pre-COVID. Are you able to have any idea or kind of estimate the impact that Sherpa's had like since the beginning of the pandemic? Like, has it been in use to prevent pneumonia and, people have been intubated for months and months?
So I wish I could give you that number, Molly, and that would be just like, the most kind of amazing thing ever if I could give you that number. The reality is we ultimately, when we transitioned the product to Vyaire, who is the acquiring company, when we switched manufacturing from our manufacturing to their manufacturing, they had to end up doing a product recall on the first manufactured lot. And it totally like threw a wrench in everything from a product launch standpoint. And so the product got, put on hold a couple of, prior to COVID. And with everything going on at a respiratory care company, it was like, we're trying to make circuits and filters and like the bare bones thing. So it was it did not have, it was unable to make a difference, which is probably my greatest, Ciel is my greatest professional achievement and moment I'm most proud of, but also most disappointed in, because ultimately we weren't there to make a difference for patients.
Yeah, I think we've all, or at least I know I have, like seen that over and over again in terms of like my own career and like things that could have been great, but like, logistically just we're in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
I'll jump in if there's not another question coming in. I'm curious at this point if you would anticipate ever leaving VC or like starting another company, or if you feel like you've found your niche there.
What's next for Kate?
Yeah. Hard to say. So I'm only, I'm only 3 years into my venture career. And I say people has been a big decision maker and factor for me in terms of my career decisions. But the other thing that's been a big deciding factor for me is, what's my rate of learning and growth in those roles. And I would say I am still in exponential growth right now in venture. I am learning so much on a daily basis, and I love that. And I'm working with great people. I'm learning a ton. So I have, no real intention of switching careers. But I also love being an operator and an entrepreneur and a founder. So I wouldn't be surprised if someday I go back into that. But for now, I get to kind of, live vicariously through our CEOs, and we are very hands-on. So I'm on 4 of our portfolio company boards and get to work very closely with the teams. So it's kind of, I get a little bit of the flavor of operating, but I don't know if I'll ever go back. We'll see.
I'm curious what surprised you the most in the medical device space versus like what you hear from other people in other kind of industries.
Yeah. Like some of the things I hear is the medical device world is really slow. So even I just think about like time to get a product to market and dollars. I have friends in the software industry. Like we have Tommy and I have a good friend, Matt Collier, who's a serial entrepreneur in developing software. And it's like, he needs less than $1 million to get to commercialization and like revenue growth. And he does it in less than a year. And I'm just like, we're barely out of the prototype phase, for that kind of capital and timeline. So it certainly is a longer road just because it's regulated and you have to meet FDA requirements. You have to check a lot of boxes from a safety perspective, whether that's, mechanical testing or biocompatibility and making sure the materials are safe. So it is slower than other industries. I think that it surprised me by how tangible the patient impact is, though. I mean, it's really fun. Like these are great engineering problems. You get to work on super challenging engineering problems just on a technical standpoint. But then to be able to go, I'm just like the first company I worked at, Pathway, within 6 months, I got to go down to South America for clinical trials to use the product out. And this was that drill to clear plaque from people's legs. And I remember going to see a case, and this woman had been in a wheelchair. She couldn't walk because she didn't have blood flow into her lower leg. And, we did our procedure with our device, and she got up and, it was like sedation only. She got up and she walked home at the end of the day. And that was the first time she'd been able to do that in a long time. And it just, you see that it's like so tangible, the impact you're making. I think that's kind of why I got into it, but actually experiencing that was really still surprising and impactful for me.
This is kind of coming from out of the medical space, but as someone who's kind of like looking for new companies doing new things, like what are some of the, I don't know, most fruitful areas of change? Like in my, like I could imagine maybe big data is going to be really fruitful and you try and connect a bunch of things for a patient, or maybe smaller sensors or more portable or better materials, or like I don't know, what do you think is kind of like a big kind of wave, or if there's anything going on right now?
Well, I think we used to say like magnets and nitinol were like the really big buzzwords in healthcare, but now it's like AI, robotics, everything has some kind of like AI, big data, and robotics components. So those are, you know, certainly areas where there's been so much innovation and advancement that it is enabling us to do new things that we could never do before. And, you know, so I think that's, you know, a really big part of it. You just look at number of startups, like literally we were at a medical conference earlier this month, and it felt like every other company was a robotics, you know, startup.
Is that for surgery or for other things? Like I just think of Da Vinci or whatever. Is it, am I thinking of the wrong thing?
So certainly Da Vinci, surgical robot, you know, so other people trying to compete in that, people trying to create ancillary products for that, but even to bring robotics into other parts of the field. So one company I really love is bringing robotics into the in vitro fertilization, or IVF. Right now, like cell separation and also fertilization of the sperm into the egg, it's largely a manual process done by hand, both selection and fertilization, and it's very operator dependent. So there are companies out there now trying to automate and bring robotics into that process in order to make it more efficient and more effective. Because if you actually look at the success rate of IVF cycles, it's really poor, and totally dependent on the skill level of the clinic who is doing, and the person who's doing those steps at the clinic. So yes, robotics in surgery, but also in many other parts of the process that touch patients' lives.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, biopsy, there's robotics going into, you know, looking at biopsy of tissue samples, and so yeah, all over the place.
Would it be safe to say some of that's like lab work, or is it like touching people and interacting with the person, or both?
Yeah, both. Like,
Both.
you know, robotics on, you know, sample preparation and biopsy, but people are developing robots to help you draw blood. Like instead of when you go in, some people have to get frequent blood draws. So new robotic systems that allow you to access arteries and veins and draw blood in a much more accurate, kind of faster, less painful way. So it's all over the map. I'm telling you, robotics is everywhere. And we happen to have, I should note, speaking of Da Vinci, one of the founding partners of Sonder Capital is Fred Mall, who was the founder of Intuitive Surgical and one of the early inventors of the Da Vinci system. So we happen to have a robotics expert on our team.
When you invest in these companies, are you aiming for a specific outcome like acquisition or IPO? Because I'm learning that those are some very different routes for companies to take. And I know that your company, Ciel, was like pretty lightweight. Like you had 4 employees and then a bunch of contracted with a lot of places. And I thought that was really unique way of doing it. Yeah, so I'm just curious about what you're looking for, like what Sonder Capital looks for if they're diverse in the outcomes that you might expect from your companies.
Yeah. Well, when we think about like the medtech industry as a whole, so M&A would be a startup being acquired by a private company and rolled in, versus IPO is a public offering and becoming public. I think our kind of average statistic is that like 75% of companies get privately acquired and 25% maybe go public. That last year was a crazy year for IPOs in medtech. So it shifted maybe a little bit, but generally that's kind of the split of the industry. But we're Sonder Capital, we're open to either, you know, pathway to liquidity, because really that's ultimately what it is the ability for shareholders to get, you know, cash out of the opportunity. We're open to either. We tend to look for ideas that we think are really transformative in terms of either the outcomes that they provide, the access to care that they provide, or disruption to the business model. And transformative for us just means that there's opportunity to create substantial value. It's not just a slightly better way to clear plaque from the arteries. It's like a whole new way to disrupt the need to even have to use a drill to clear plaque from your arteries, to save a bunch of costs in the overall system. So we're really looking for transformative ideas. These tend to be really big ideas that take a lot of money and a lot of time. And some of them will go public, some of them will be acquired. We're kind of agnostic to what that exit looks like.
What are some of the biggest pitfalls or roadblocks you see a lot of the companies you're working with fall into?
I think, one of the big things I always coach people is that the time and money required to develop something, has to be linked with the outcome. So if you're doing something kind of incremental, like it is a slight improvement on what's existing today and has some small amount of benefit, that's okay, right? Like a lot of Ciel was very incremental. This was just a slightly different way to deliver subglottic suctioning. But we took just a small amount of money and had a very lean team to develop it. And so, our exit was not this $1 billion exit, but it was great for the amount of money we took in. Like all of our investors were super happy with it. But if we had taken $100 million, to develop it, that those don't line up, right? The value we were creating, we had to raise a little bit of money because of that value, just to size things appropriately. So I always, one thing sometimes I see entrepreneurs do wrong is try to pursue projects that are going to require tons of time and money where the outcome really just doesn't justify it. And so you've got to think about that equation, both for yourself as kind of the entrepreneur and common stockholder, but also for investors, because if they don't see the value equation, then you won't be able to raise money. A lot of entrepreneurs at the early stages are really ownership conscious. So they're like, oh, I don't want to take an investor money, or I want some crazy valuation for what I'm doing. But the reality is it's so much better to just to raise capital and make progress. Because if you own 100% of something that never is worth anything, what good does that do to anybody, versus owning 20% of something that turns into the next $1 billion idea? That's real value creation. And that's how you get stuff to patients, is actually making forward progress. So I mean, that's definitely one thing that I see a lot of entrepreneurs, especially first-time entrepreneurs, be so conscious of ownership and to the point of losing the opportunity to make progress and do things.
One of the things I've heard around startups is that the be disruptive or the move fast, break things, all of that is a little bit safer when you're talking about devices and apps, or non-essential things like phones. What do you need to be? Are you guys more careful? I'm guessing the answer is yes. And what does that mean in terms of, I don't know, disruption or the things that you're looking for?
Yeah, I mean, well, of course, I feel like you can't say that without talking about Theranos, right? And how all of that, that's not the way to do things. As somebody who's been in the industry, it is just so appalling to me to let something go to the market when it's not ready or safe for patients, or providing reliable response, reliable data that people are making potentially life-changing decisions based on. So, so yeah, I think one way to summarize, minimally viable product in the software world versus the healthcare world, there's a much higher bar in the healthcare world. Your minimally viable product has to be safe, and effective versus standard of care as a bare minimum to even bring that to market. So there's a lot of testing. We believe strongly in failing fast, but not at the expense of patient care or patient outcomes. That's, we always say patient first. That's what drives decision making. You got to get to that minimally viable product, but you have to do it responsibly and making sure that, you're looking out for the patient's well-being first and foremost.
Well, I think we're going to wrap it up then. Kate, thank you on behalf of Emily and myself. We're so appreciative of you for doing this, and to everybody for coming. This was really great, and love to see you all next month. We have another 06 alumna, Juliana Stockton, also from that first class. We'll speak about justice, equity, design, and innovation, a new approach to teacher preparation. So Mike, did you want to say something before we finished up? I'm not-
No, just clapping and thanking Kate again for the wonderful presentation. Thanks very much for sharing your experience.
Yeah, thank you guys for participating. It's fun.
It was so great to see you all. I'm going to put a link in the chat on Thursday if you want to join us again on Zoom. We're having an event on campus, but it will be live streamed. So if you are interested in sort of ethics and tech, another alum from 06, Frances Hogan, is going to speak on campus, and she'll be in some classes, and then she will speak in the auditorium. So if you're local to Olin, let me know. We can help you reserve a seat, or you can check it out online. I'm sure we'll send the recording around, but we'll share this recording as well with those who couldn't make it. There were a lot of people who were like, can't make it, send me the video. So they'll love seeing this too. So thank you all for your insightful questions. And I am just really energized to hear, I have no medical experience, so I love hearing your expertise. It really instills a lot of confidence in like what's next.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, everyone. Have a good
Thank
night.
you.
Bye.